Okay, here we go on this series that I've called The Care and Training of the Supernatural Horse. And hopefully, you will have all had a look at the article that I wrote a few years ago that explains what I mean by a supernatural horse. And if you haven't already done that, I would suggest that you go to the Balance website and look for that article. Otherwise, it probably seems a bit of an odd thing to even think about. Before we start looking at the management and the care of the horse and the riding of the horse with this aim, I want to just take it back a notch and talk a little bit about how we choose the horses that we take on and bring into our lives to ride, because I think that's something that really needs to be considered. And first of all, one could argue that in the Western world, there are very few people now that actually need to ride. It's a leisure activity, it's a hobby, a sport. It's something that we do as humans for our own pleasure. For this reason, I think it does need to be justified to some extent, and for us to think about what we can give to the horse in order to justify asking them to do this for us. So, for example, when we think about buying a horse or taking on a horse, are we thinking about what we can give them in terms of the environment? Do we have access to suitable land? Do we have the time to give them? Do we have the knowledge we need to look after them well, or do we intend to put them into the care of somebody else who has more knowledge? If we don't have these things, then one could argue that maybe one shouldn't even be taking this on in the first place. I know some people will find this a little bit hard, and they will probably argue that, well, it's not fair that only wealthy people can have horses. But I'm afraid at the risk of being controversial, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think one doesn't need to be particularly wealthy, but one does need to be willing and able to provide a horse with what it needs to keep it healthy and happy. If you can't do that, then choose another hobby, or ride but go to somewhere where they actually have horses that ride, but don't attempt to keep one and take it under your own guardianship. Unfortunately, just loving horses isn't enough. There has to be a knowledge and awareness of their needs. Otherwise, all sorts of problems can occur. And I've seen in the past people who've said, "Oh, I love my horse." And then when you look at the way the horse is living, you think, well, that's not translating into anything that is actually protecting the horse. If it feels incredibly important to have a particular breed that isn't native to the country that you live in, then at least look for someone that's breeding and has been breeding that type of horse in your country for long enough for the horses to adapt. At least that's the kind of way of doing it if you have to do it. But certainly importing horses from one climate to another it's not a wicked thing to do, but it's not the kindest thing to do, and it's not really in keeping with this idea of helping the horse to have the best type of life it can. You've got. And something that comes up from time to time is when I see people take on horses that are unsuitable for the environment. And an example would be somebody who lives in an incredibly hot climate, where there's a lot of sun and a lot of heat, and then buying from Europe in a cool climate a horse like a Friesian, for example, with a black coat and a heavy kind of breed, and then importing it into that hot, dry climate, and then wondering why the horse is having all sorts of problems and having a very unhappy time, because it's just such a contrast to the way it's been brought up in its younger life. Another thing to consider is the type and the breed of horse that one chooses, because there are certainly many breeds and types that have been bred to be riding horses for centuries, and they have been bred in a particular way to make it as easy as possible to ride and make them athletic. There are other breeds that have become very popular in the last few years, and I'm thinking particularly of the heavy breeds like the Shires, the Percherons, the Belgians. Now, these horses have become very popular because they've often got lovely temperaments, they're very impressive, and people are buying them that really can't work with them particularly well, because a lot of these horses need, when they're ridden, a lot of help to be in balance. And so when you've got a very large animal who's very unbalanced and relatively small rider on top trying to help them to be rebalanced, it's not impossible, and in fact good training should be able to help horses of any breed to be better balanced and organised. But it again is working against the odds, and if you are not a skilled rider and you don't have those abilities, then you're going to struggle. Another thing to consider is the rider's weight and size, because if you're looking at a horse to ride, it's important that it's an appropriate size of horse in terms of its height and its build to carry the rider in a way that can be comfortable and without putting a lot of stress on its body. So the size of the rider is important, because depending on the height, it will determine what seat size in a saddle is required. So if you've got an incredibly short-backed horse and a small horse, trying to accommodate a tall rider that needs a saddle that's actually bigger than the horse can comfortably take, that's a recipe for disaster. And actually for the rider that's tall and needing a larger saddle to try and squeeze themselves into a saddle that's too small, that creates problems as well, because you end up with the rider bouncing around all over the cantle and putting a lot of pressure in a vulnerable area of the horse's back. So that doesn't work. And if you've got a rider that is very heavy for a smaller horse, particularly if they're overweight and unfit, that can also cause all sorts of problems. And this study that's been done, I mentioned earlier, that has been done recently in the UK, has been looking at that and very definitely shows the impact on horses when they're asked to carry riders that are too heavy for them. And obviously more research needs to be done. So, there are times when a rider, and certainly within the work that we do with the saddles, where it's clear that the rider is too heavy for a particular horse, and it doesn't matter how good the saddle is, or no matter how good the riding is, the physical weight of the rider is too much for that particular horse to cope with. So that's another consideration to think of. So here endeth the first lesson. And it makes me smile a bit, because it does, I know for some people this will sound as if I'm standing on a soapbox and preaching, and I don't really want that to be the case. It's not my intention for that to happen. But I do want this series to make people think a little bit, and not just assume that every person has the right to own and ride a horse in any way that they choose. That's the whole point of this, is to consider it from the horse's perspective and to look for the highest expression of the way that we can ride horses and have them in our lives. So from time to time it probably sounds as if I'm standing here wagging my finger and saying thou shalt not. That isn't quite the intention, but and I apologise if that's how it's coming over. But I'm going to say what I feel, and if you agree with it, that's great. If you don't agree with it, that's fine. But it's just there to perhaps make people think a little bit. So this actual presentation has been just voice over with some slightly random slides in the background just to give you something to look at while I'm talking. Future ones, I'm going to try and use a combination of slides, diagrams and video clips where we can find video clips that are appropriate. So the format isn't going to be the same on every one of these little presentations in the series. So anyway, well, until the next one, I will say goodbye.